The text message arrived at 0347 hours while I was reviewing tactical reports in my quarters at Fort Bragg. 3 words that would change everything. Family dinner Sunday? I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My sister Madison had a way of making invitations sound like ultimatums. No please, no context. Just an expectation wrapped in the assumption that I had nothing better to do than drop everything for her convenience. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the cursor blink in the empty reply field. Outside my window, the pre-dawn darkness held the familiar quiet of a base preparing for another day of precision and purpose. I hadn't been home to Denver in 18 months, not since Dad's retirement party, where Madison had introduced me to her friends as my sister who plays Army. The words had stung then, mostly because they came so easily to her, like she'd been practicing that particular dismissal for years. But what hurt more was the way our parents had simply smiled and changed the subject, as if reducing my career to a child's game was perfectly acceptable dinner conversation. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell. That's who I was in every official capacity, every briefing room, every mission debrief. But in the Walsh family home on Maple Drive, I'd always just been the daughter who chose something they couldn't understand, something that took me away from birthday parties and holiday traditions and the comfortable predictability of civilian life. Madison had taken the opposite path. After college, she'd moved back home, taken a job at a local marketing firm, and settled into the kind of life our parents had mapped out for both of us. She was the daughter who called every Tuesday, who remembered anniversaries, who brought the right wine to dinner parties and knew which fork to use for salad. She was everything they wanted in a daughter, and I was everything they tolerated. The divide hadn't always been there. Growing up, Madison and I had been inseparable, 2 years apart but sharing the same stubborn streak and competitive spirit. We'd built forts in the backyard, competed in everything from swim meets to science fairs, and defended each other fiercely against playground bullies. But somewhere between my acceptance to West Point and her junior year of college, something shifted. The sister who used to brag about having a future soldier in the family began treating my uniform like an embarrassment. It started small. Comments about how military life was so rigid and how she could never handle all those rules. Then it escalated to jokes about my boy haircut and observations about how I was getting so serious all the time. By the time I made captain, Madison had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, telling people I was so brave to give up having a normal life and wondering aloud if I'd ever want to settle down and do something more feminine. Our parents, Robert and Linda Walsh, had always been conflict-averse. Dad worked in insurance, a steady job that provided a comfortable suburban life with predictable rhythms. Mom taught elementary school and believed that family harmony was worth any amount of personal compromise. When tensions arose between Madison and me, their solution was always the same: smooth things over, change the subject, and pretend the underlying issues didn't exist. The last time I'd tried to address Madison's comments directly, Mom had pulled me aside and suggested I was being too sensitive. Dad had simply shrugged and said, "You know how Madison is. She doesn't mean anything by it." But Madison did mean something by it. Every dismissive comment, every eye roll, every time she described my job as playing soldier, was deliberate. She meant to diminish me, to reduce 12 years of service, multiple deployments, and a hard-earned rank to something trivial and childish. The irony was that Madison had no idea what my actual responsibilities entailed. She knew I was in the Army, knew I'd been deployed, knew I'd been promoted over the years. But she'd never asked about the specifics, never shown interest in understanding what a logistics commander actually does. She didn't know about the supply chains I managed, the soldiers under my command, or the critical missions that depended on my expertise. To her, I was just Sarah, who wore camouflage and followed orders. What she definitely didn't know was that I'd recently been selected for a promotion to colonel, pending final approval. The announcement would come through official channels within the next month, but I hadn't shared the news with my family yet. There hadn't seemed to be a point. Madison would find some way to minimize it, and our parents would smile politely and change the subject to something more comfortable, like Madison's latest marketing campaign or the neighbor's new landscaping. I set my phone down without responding to the text and returned to my reports. 3 hours later, as the sun began to rise over the North Carolina landscape, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Mom. "Hi, sweetheart. Did you see Madison's message? We're so hoping you can make it this Sunday. It's been too long since we've all been together, and Madison has some exciting news to share. She's bringing Jake, and we're all dying to get to know him better. I know it's short notice, but you know how spontaneous Madison can be. We'd love to have you home. Jake." Madison had mentioned him in passing during our last awkward phone call, describing him as someone from work without providing any details. Based on Madison's dating history, I'd assumed he was another marketing executive or sales manager, someone who fit neatly into her social circle and shared her priorities. The guilt in Mom's voice was unmistakable. She knew the family dynamics were strained, knew that these gatherings often left me feeling like an outsider in my own family. But she also knew that pointing this out directly would force a conversation no one wanted to have. So instead, she used gentle pressure disguised as enthusiasm, hoping that family loyalty would override my reservations. I considered my options. I could decline, as I had several times over the past year, and deal with the passive-aggressive fallout for the next 6 months. Or I could go, endure whatever new forms of dismissal Madison had perfected, and maintain the fragile peace that kept our family functioning. Neither option felt particularly appealing, but the colonel in me recognized a tactical decision when I saw one. Sometimes you choose the mission that serves the greater objective, even when the immediate cost feels too high. I picked up my phone and typed a simple response: "I'll be there." What I didn't know was that this family dinner would become the moment when two worlds collided in ways none of us could have predicted. Madison's exciting news was about to intersect with my carefully guarded professional life in the most unexpected way possible. But for now, I simply confirmed my attendance and prepared to once again walk into a room where my achievements would be treated as inconveniences and my career would be reduced to a punchline. The stage was set for a confrontation that would finally force everyone to see me clearly, whether they wanted to or not. The flight from Fayetteville to Denver gave me 3 hours to think about why I kept returning to a place that felt less like home and more like hostile territory. As the plane climbed above the North Carolina landscape, I watched the geometric patterns of military installations give way to civilian subdivisions, each transition marking another layer of distance between who I was at work and who I became around my family. My seatmate, a businessman in an expensive suit, glanced at my uniform with the kind of polite acknowledgement civilians offer military personnel. A respectful nod, a brief smile, then back to his laptop screen. He didn't ask questions, didn't thank me for my service, didn't make assumptions about what I did or why I did it. It was refreshing in its simplicity. Back at Fort Bragg, respect wasn't something I had to earn through family connections or social positioning. It came with the rank on my collar and the results I delivered. My soldiers didn't care that I preferred tactical manuals to romance novels, or that I could field strip an M4 faster than most of them could text their girlfriends. They cared that I got them the equipment they needed, when they needed it, and that I brought them home safe from deployments. Major Rodriguez had seen me off at the airport, shaking his head when I told him where I was going. "Ma'am, with all due respect, your family doesn't deserve you," he'd said, loading my overnight bag into his truck. Rodriguez had worked under my command for 2 years, through a deployment to Kuwait and countless stateside operations. He'd seen me coordinate supply drops under enemy fire and negotiate with contractors who tried to shortchange the military. He knew what I was capable of because he'd witnessed it firsthand. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. At work, I was surrounded by people who understood dedication, sacrifice, and the weight of responsibility. Men and women who knew that precision and preparation could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. People who respected expertise and rewarded competence, regardless of gender or background. Colonel Harrison, my commanding officer, had pulled me aside yesterday before I left for leave. "Sarah, I know family visits can be challenging," he'd said with the kind of understanding that comes from experience. "But remember, their inability to see your value doesn't diminish it. You're one of the finest officers I've had the privilege to command, and that promotion to colonel is going to be official within the month. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. The promotion. I still hadn't told my family about it. Part of me wondered if it would make any difference to them, if the additional rank would somehow translate into the respect I'd been seeking for years. But deep down, I knew better. Madison would find a way to minimize it. Probably something about how rank doesn't matter in the real world, or how military promotions are just political. Our parents would congratulate me with the same enthusiasm they showed for Madison's quarterly sales bonuses, treating it as just another incremental step in a career they didn't understand. What they definitely didn't know was how that promotion had come about. Last year, during a joint exercise with Allied forces, I'd identified critical gaps in the supply chain that could have left an entire battalion without essential equipment in hostile territory. Working 18-hour days for 3 weeks, I'd redesigned the logistics protocol, coordinated with 7 different agencies, and ensured that every soldier had what they needed when they needed it. The commanding general had personally recommended me for early promotion, calling my work exemplary leadership under pressure. Madison, meanwhile, had spent last year planning corporate retreat activities and designing PowerPoint presentations about brand synergy. Not that there was anything wrong with marketing work, but the disconnect between how we each spent our professional lives was vast. She crafted messages about products that people might want. I managed systems that people needed to survive. The irony was that my skills would translate perfectly to civilian leadership roles if I ever chose that path. Logistics management, personnel oversight, crisis response, budget administration, strategic planning. These weren't military-specific abilities. They were executive competencies that Fortune 500 companies paid enormous salaries to secure. But my family saw only the uniform, not the expertise it represented. During my last deployment, I received a care package from home. Mom had included homemade cookies, Dad had sent a Denver Broncos magazine, and Madison had contributed a pink nail polish with a note that said, "For when you want to feel pretty again." The nail polish now sat unopened in my desk drawer back at Fort Bragg, a small monument to how little my own sister understood about my life. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. She didn't know that I'd learned to navigate hostile negotiations with foreign contractors who tried to intimidate female officers. She didn't know that I'd earned the respect of infantry commanders who initially questioned whether a logistics officer could understand their needs. She didn't know that junior officers sought my mentorship because I'd proven that competence trumped gender stereotypes in the right environment. The plane began its descent into Denver, and I could see the sprawling suburban landscape where I'd grown up. Neat rows of houses with manicured lawns, shopping centers anchored by chain restaurants, the comfortable predictability of middle-class America. It looked smaller than I remembered, as if my perspective had been permanently altered by years of seeing the world through a different lens. My phone buzzed with a text from Staff Sergeant Chen, one of my most reliable NCOs. "Ma'am, just wanted to let you know the shipment to the 82nd came through ahead of schedule. Your contingency planning saved us when the primary supplier fell through. Have a good weekend with your family." Chen's message reminded me why I did this work. Not for recognition from people who couldn't comprehend its importance, but for soldiers like him who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between mission success and failure. For young lieutenants who needed guidance navigating their first commands. For the countless military families who depended on effective logistics to bring their loved ones home safely. As the plane touched down in Denver, I straightened my uniform and prepared to enter a world where none of that mattered. Where I would once again become Madison's sister who plays soldier. Where my achievements would be politely acknowledged and quickly forgotten. Where my expertise would be treated as an interesting hobby rather than a serious profession. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the impending promotion. Or maybe it was simply years of accumulated confidence from succeeding in an environment that demanded excellence. I wasn't the uncertain young woman who'd left Denver 12 years ago, hoping to prove herself worthy of respect. I was a lieutenant colonel with a track record of achievement, surrounded by colleagues who valued my contributions and recognized my potential. Whatever happened at this family dinner, whoever this Jake person turned out to be, I would face it with the same composure I brought to briefing rooms and operations centers. I would remember that other people's inability to see my worth didn't diminish it, and that respect earned through competence was far more valuable than approval given through family obligation. The foundation had been laid years ago. Now it was time to see if my family was ready to acknowledge what I'd built upon it. The rental car smelled like artificial pine and sanitizer, a sharp contrast to the familiar scent of diesel and metal that permeated military vehicles. As I navigated the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood, muscle memory guided me through turns I'd made thousands of times before. But everything looked different now. Smaller, somehow more fragile, like a movie set designed to represent suburban comfort rather than the real thing. I pulled into the parking lot of Henderson's Coffee Shop, a local institution that had remained unchanged since my high school days. The same red brick exterior, the same hand-painted sign, the same cluster of outdoor tables where teenagers gathered after school. I'd suggested meeting Mom here instead of going straight to the house, needing a buffer zone before diving into the full family dynamics. Mom was already waiting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that read, "World's Best Teacher." She looked older than I remembered, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, her face carrying new lines around the eyes. But her smile was the same, warm, genuine, tinged with the slight worry that seemed to be her permanent expression whenever I came home. "Sarah, honey," she said, standing to embrace me, "you look wonderful, so strong and confident." I returned the hug, noting how she felt smaller in my arms than she used to. "Hi, Mom, thanks for meeting me here." We settled into our seats, and she immediately began the ritual of catching up that always felt more like an interrogation disguised as motherly concern. How was the flight? Was I eating enough? Did I have time for any kind of social life? Each question carried the underlying assumption that military life was somehow insufficient, that I must be missing essential elements of human happiness. "Madison is so excited about tonight," Mom said, stirring sugar into her coffee with unnecessary vigor. "She's been planning this dinner for weeks. She really wants you two to get along better." The diplomatic language wasn't lost on me. Get along better was family code for tolerate Madison's behavior without calling it out. It was the same phrase Mom had used during high school when Madison would borrow my belongings without asking, or in college when she'd tell people I was going through a phase with my military aspirations. "She's really found herself with this marketing job," Mom continued, "and Jake seems like such a nice young man. Very polite, very ambitious. They make a lovely couple." I nodded non-committally, sipping my black coffee. Mom's enthusiasm for Madison's relationships was nothing new. Every boyfriend was wonderful and perfect for her, until they inevitably weren't. Madison had a pattern of dating men who treated her like an accessory, pretty and charming enough to enhance their image but not substantial enough to challenge their assumptions. "What does Jake do exactly?" I asked, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. "Oh, he works with Madison at the agency. Some kind of account management, I think. They met during a client presentation and just clicked immediately. Madison says he really understands her creative vision." Creative vision? I almost smiled at that. Madison's idea of creativity involved choosing between serif and sans serif fonts for corporate logos. But I kept my expression neutral, knowing that any hint of skepticism would be interpreted as jealousy or sisterly competition. "That's nice," I said. "I'm sure they're very compatible." Mom leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Sarah, I hope you'll try to be supportive tonight. I know you and Madison don't always see eye to eye, but this is important to her. She's been working so hard to build a life here, and Jake is a big part of that." There it was, the preemptive request for good behavior, delivered with the gentle guilt that had been Mom's primary parenting tool for as long as I could remember. Don't make waves. Don't rock the boat. Don't say anything that might disturb the carefully maintained fiction that we were a perfectly harmonious family. "I'm not planning to cause any problems," I said. "I just want to have a nice dinner and meet this person who's important to Madison." But even as I said the words, I felt the familiar weight of expectations settling on my shoulders. I would be expected to laugh at Madison's jokes, even when they came at my expense. I would be expected to show appropriate interest in her work stories, even when they revealed how little she understood about real responsibility. I would be expected to be grateful for being included, even when that inclusion came with the implicit understanding that I was the outsider being graciously accommodated. "I know you do, honey," Mom said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "And I know this is hard for you sometimes, being so far away, living such a different life. But you're both my daughters, and I love you equally. I just want us all to be happy." The thing was, I believed her. Mom did love us equally, in her way. But equality and understanding were different things. She loved me despite my career choice, not because of it. She supported me while secretly hoping I'd eventually choose something more conventional, something that wouldn't take me away from family gatherings and holiday traditions. My phone buzzed with a text from Captain Williams, one of my junior officers. "Ma'am, just confirming the logistics brief is still scheduled for Tuesday morning. Looking forward to your input on the new procurement protocols." I typed back quickly, "Confirmed. See you at 0800. Mom noticed the exchange. "Work again?" "Just confirming a meeting for next week," I said, sliding my phone back into my pocket. She shook her head with the kind of disapproval that tried to disguise itself as concern. "Don't you ever get tired of being so scheduled? Everything timed and planned and official?" The question revealed more about her worldview than mine. To Mom, structure and precision were burdens rather than tools. She couldn't understand that the scheduling she criticized was what allowed me to coordinate complex operations involving thousands of people and millions of dollars in equipment. That the official protocols she dismissed were what kept soldiers alive and missions successful. "It's just how military life works," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "People depend on that reliability." "But what about your own needs? Your own happiness? When do you get to just be spontaneous?" I almost laughed. Spontaneity was a luxury that people in life-or-death professions couldn't afford. When soldiers needed ammunition or medical supplies, there was no room for improvisation. When evacuation timelines were measured in minutes, there was no time for spontaneous decision-making. But explaining this to Mom would only reinforce her belief that I'd chosen a life of unnecessary restrictions. "I find satisfaction in the work," I said instead, "knowing that what I do matters, that it makes a difference." Mom nodded, but I could see she didn't really understand. To her, job satisfaction came from personal relationships and creative fulfillment, not from operational excellence and mission accomplishment. She measured happiness in social connections and family harmony, not in professional achievement and strategic impact. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken expectations hanging between us. As we gathered our things to leave, Mom touched my arm gently. "Just remember tonight that Madison loves you," she said. "She has her own way of showing it, but she does. And she's excited about introducing Jake to the family. Try to give them both a chance." I nodded, already steeling myself for the evening ahead. Whatever happened at dinner, whatever form Madison's latest performance would take, I would handle it with the same professionalism I brought to every challenging situation. I would remember that my value wasn't determined by my family's ability to recognize it, and that their approval wasn't necessary for my continued success. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner would be different somehow. Maybe it was the way Mom had mentioned Jake's name with unusual emphasis, or maybe it was simply my own growing impatience with playing a role that no longer fit. Either way, the evening promised to be more significant than anyone anticipated. As I drove toward the house on Maple Drive, I prepared myself for another exercise in family diplomacy, unaware that the man Madison was so eager to introduce would turn my carefully maintained boundaries upside down. The Walsh family home at 1247 Maple Drive looked exactly as I remembered it, down to the seasonal wreath hanging on the front door and the perfectly maintained flower beds that bordered the walkway. Dad's silver Toyota Camry sat in the driveway next to Madison's white BMW, a recent upgrade that she'd mentioned during our last phone call, along with detailed explanations about lease terms and monthly payments that I hadn't asked to hear. But there was a third car parked on the street that I didn't recognize, a black Jeep Wrangler with government plates. The detail caught my attention immediately, a professional habit that had been drilled into me through years of security briefings and threat assessments. Government vehicles weren't uncommon in Denver, but they were unusual in suburban neighborhoods on Sunday evenings. I sat in my rental car for a moment, observing the house through trained eyes. The living room curtains were drawn back, revealing warm yellow light and the movement of people inside. Through the front window, I could see Dad arranging something on the mantelpiece while Mom bustled between the kitchen and dining room, her arms full of what looked like serving dishes. Madison appeared briefly in the frame, gesturing animatedly at someone just out of view. Taking a deep breath, I gathered my overnight bag and the bottle of wine I'd picked up at the airport, a gesture of goodwill that would probably go unnoticed among the evening's other tensions. The front walk felt longer than it used to, each step carrying me further from the professional competence I'd left at Fort Bragg and closer to the familial awkwardness that awaited inside. Before I could knock, the door swung open to reveal Dad's familiar face, creased into the kind of smile that tried too hard to project enthusiasm. Robert Walsh had aged well, his hair now completely gray, but his posture still straight from years of office work that demanded long hours but little physical strain. "There's my girl," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like his perpetual aftershave and the lingering scent of whatever Mom was cooking. Come in, come in. Madison and Jake are already here, and your mother's been fussing over dinner all afternoon." The interior of the house enveloped me in a sensory time capsule. Lemon-scented furniture polish, the faint mustiness of carpet that had been cleaned too many times, and the distinctive aroma of Mom's pot roast recipe that she'd been perfecting since I was in elementary school. Family photos lined the hallway, a chronological progression of Walsh family milestones that told the story of two daughters growing up and growing apart. Most of the recent photos featured Madison prominently, her college graduation, various work events, holiday celebrations where I'd been notably absent. My own military portraits were relegated to a smaller section near the end, formal shots that looked out of place among the casual family snapshots. The visual narrative was clear. Madison's life was integrated into the family story, while mine existed on the periphery. "Sarah," Mom's voice carried from the kitchen, pitched with the artificial brightness she used when she wanted everyone to believe everything was perfect. Perfect timing. I was just putting the finishing touches on dinner. I followed Dad into the living room, where Madison was perched on the edge of the sofa like a carefully arranged centerpiece. She'd clearly put thought into her appearance. Hair professionally styled, makeup expertly applied, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most soldiers made in a week. But it was the man sitting beside her who immediately commanded my attention. Jake Thompson looked nothing like Madison's usual type. Instead of the polished marketing executive she typically dated, this man had the unmistakable bearing of someone with military training. His posture was precise without being rigid, his handshake firm and direct when Dad introduced us, his eyes alert and assessing in a way that suggested professional rather than casual observation skills. "Jake, this is my daughter Sarah," Dad said, his voice carrying the slight awkwardness that always accompanied my introduction. "She's in the Army, stationed down in North Carolina." "Ma'am," Jake said, rising from the sofa with a fluidity that spoke of practiced respect. His greeting was formal but not uncomfortable, the kind of acknowledgement that suggested familiarity with military protocols. Madison's laugh cut through the moment like a blade. "Oh, don't be so formal, Jake. This is just my sister, not a real officer or anything." "She's more like a supply clerk, right, Sarah? Making sure everyone has enough pencils and toilet paper?" The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Dad's smile faltered slightly, and Mom called from the kitchen with forced cheer about needing help with the salad. But Jake's expression didn't change at all. If anything, his attention seemed to sharpen, his gaze moving between Madison and me with the kind of analytical focus I recognized from fellow officers assessing a tactical situation. "Actually," I said carefully, keeping my voice level, "I'm a lieutenant colonel in Logistics Command. I oversee supply chain operations for multiple battalions." Madison waved her hand dismissively. "Same thing, really. Moving boxes around, keeping track of inventory. It's very administrative." Quote, the word hung in the air like an insult disguised as description. Administrative. As if coordinating the movement of critical supplies across multiple theaters of operation was equivalent to filing paperwork in a corporate office. As if the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure didn't often depend on the precision of those administrative details. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that most people would miss but that I caught immediately. His hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, shifted slightly into a more structured position. When he spoke, his voice carried a careful neutrality that suggested significant self-control. Logistics is actually one of the most critical aspects of military operations, he said. Without effective supply chain management, even the best tactical plans fall apart. Madison laughed again, the sound sharp and condescending. Oh, Jake, you don't need to be polite. Sarah knows her job isn't exactly frontline heroics. She's more like support staff. Very important support staff, of course, but still just moving things from one place to another. The dismissal was so casual, so perfectly crafted to minimize my role while maintaining plausible deniability about malicious intent. Madison had perfected this technique over years of practice, delivering cuts that were deep enough to wound but subtle enough to be dismissed as misunderstanding if challenged directly. But Jake's reaction was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. His breathing had shifted to a more controlled pattern, his shoulders had squared almost imperceptibly, and his eyes had taken on the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was processing information that others in the room couldn't see. Mom emerged from the kitchen carrying a large serving bowl, her timing so perfectly coincidental that it was obviously intentional. "Dinner's ready," she announced with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she'd been monitoring the conversation from the next room. "Why don't we all sit down before everything gets cold?" As we moved toward the dining room, Jake fell into step beside me, his movement precise and purposeful. In a voice low enough that only I could hear, he said, "Ma'am, if I may ask, what's your current assignment?" The question was phrased with the kind of specificity that suggested professional interest rather than casual curiosity. The formal address, the technical language, the underlying assumption that my assignment was something significant. These weren't the conversational patterns of a marketing account manager. "I command the 108th Sustainment Brigade," I replied quietly, studying his reaction. "Joint logistics operations for Special Forces units." Jake stopped walking entirely for a fraction of a second, his composure cracking just enough to reveal surprise, recognition, and something that looked very much like concern. When he recovered, his expression had shifted into something I recognized immediately, the look of a subordinate who had just realized they were in the presence of a superior officer. But before either of us could process this moment further, Madison's voice cut through our quiet exchange, with the kind of performative enthusiasm that demanded attention. "Come on, you two, don't lag behind. Jake, you simply must try Mom's famous pot roast. It's the only thing she's cooked that's actually edible." The casual cruelty toward our mother, delivered with a smile and a laugh, was vintage Madison. But as we entered the dining room, I noticed Jake's reaction to the comment, a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested disapproval rather than amusement. Whatever was happening here, whatever Jake Thompson's real identity might be, the evening was already proving more complex than anyone had anticipated. The stage was set for revelations that would shatter the careful facades everyone had worked so hard to maintain. The dining room table was set with Mom's good china, the same floral pattern that had graced special occasions throughout my childhood. Candlelight flickered across the polished surface, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the tension building beneath the surface of our carefully orchestrated family gathering. Madison had positioned herself directly across from me, with Jake to her right and our parents anchoring the ends of the table like diplomatic referees. The first course passed with the kind of stilted conversation that families deploy when they're determined to avoid contentious topics. Dad discussed his latest insurance claims. Mom shared updates about her third-grade students. And Madison regaled us with stories about her marketing campaigns that somehow always positioned her as the creative genius saving incompetent clients from their own poor judgment. Jake remained largely quiet during these exchanges, contributing polite responses when directly addressed, but otherwise observing with the kind of focused attention that made me increasingly certain about his background. His posture never relaxed, his answers were precise without being verbose, and his eyes constantly scanned the room with the systematic awareness of someone trained to assess threats and opportunities. "So Jake," Dad said as Mom cleared the salad plates, "Madison tells us you work at the marketing agency with her. What's your specialty there?" The question hung in the air for a moment longer than it should have. Jake's hesitation was subtle but unmistakable, the pause of someone choosing between different versions of the truth. "I handle special accounts," he said finally. "Government contracts, mostly. projects that require security clearances and specialized protocols. Madison jumped in with a laugh that sounded increasingly forced. He's being modest. Jake's practically running the entire government division, all those boring military contracts that nobody else wants to deal with. Tank advertisements and recruitment campaigns and whatever else the Pentagon wastes money on. I watched Jake's face carefully as Madison spoke. The muscle in his jaw tightened incrementally with each dismissive word, particularly when she mentioned the Pentagon and military contracts. His breathing remained controlled, but I could see the effort it was taking. "What kind of security clearance do you have?" I asked directly, my question cutting through Madison's monologue. Jake met my eyes across the table. "Secret," he said quietly, "with some compartmentalized access as needed." Madison rolled her eyes. "Oh God, you two aren't going to start talking shop, are you? It's so boring when military people get together. All that acronym nonsense and secret handshake stuff." Mom returned from the kitchen carrying the pot roast, her timing once again suspiciously convenient. "Let's not talk business at dinner," she said with forced cheer. "This is supposed to be a celebration." "Celebration?" I asked. Madison's face lit up with the kind of radiant smile she reserved for her biggest announcements. "We didn't want to steal your thunder by saying anything earlier, but Jake and I have some news." She reached for Jake's hand, but I noticed he didn't return her enthusiasm. If anything, he looked increasingly uncomfortable, his gaze alternating between Madison and me with growing concern. "We're engaged," Madison announced, her voice pitched high with excitement. "Jake proposed last weekend, and we wanted to tell the family together. Isn't it perfect? We're thinking about a spring wedding, something elegant but not too formal. Nothing too military or stuffy." The barb was delivered with Madison's signature precision, a celebration announcement that somehow managed to include a dismissal of my lifestyle preferences. Our parents immediately erupted in congratulations, Dad reaching across to shake Jake's hand while Mom actually teared up with joy. "Oh, honey, this is wonderful," Mom gushed. "I'm so happy for you both. Jake, welcome to the family." But Jake's response was notably restrained. "Thank you, Mrs. Walsh. That's very kind." Madison was practically glowing with satisfaction, basking in the attention and approval that had always come so easily to her. "I can't wait to start planning. Sarah, you'll be my maid of honor, won't you? I mean, I know your schedule is probably busy with all your supply deliveries and paperwork, but family comes first, right?" The casual cruelty was breathtaking in its efficiency. In a single sentence, she'd managed to reduce my career to menial labor, while simultaneously demanding my participation in her celebration, and implying that my military service was somehow less important than her social events. Something inside me finally snapped, not into anger, but into the kind of crystal-clear focus that came when a situation demanded immediate and decisive action. "Actually, Madison," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned to project in briefing rooms full of senior officers, "my schedule is quite demanding. I'm currently overseeing logistics operations for multiple Special Forces units, coordinating supply chains across 7 different theaters of operation, and managing a budget that exceeds most corporate annual revenues." Madison waved her hand dismissively. "Sarah, you don't need to exaggerate. It's just family." "I'm not exaggerating," I continued, my tone remaining level but gaining steel. "I command over 3,000 soldiers, manage relationships with international allies, and make decisions that directly impact national security operations. Last month, I coordinated an emergency resupply mission that prevented a Special Forces unit from being overrun in hostile territory." Quote. "Oh, please," Madison laughed, but there was an edge to it now. "You're a glorified shipping clerk. Don't try to make it sound like you're some kind of general or something." That's when Jake stood up. The movement was so sudden and precise that it immediately commanded everyone's attention. He didn't speak at first, just stood at attention beside his chair with the kind of military bearing that was impossible to fake or misinterpret. "Madison," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, "I need you to stop talking." Madison blinked in surprise. "Jake, what are you?" "Stop," he repeated, more firmly this time. Then he turned to face me directly, his expression shifting into something I recognized immediately, the look of a soldier addressing a superior officer. In one fluid motion, Jake came to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent dining room. "Captain Jake Thompson, 5th Special Forces Group. I need to respectfully inform you that this woman has been mocking my commanding officer." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to absorb sound from the surrounding air. Madison's face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, as the implications of Jake's words began to register. "Your commanding officer?" she whispered. Jake maintained his salute, his eyes fixed on mine. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell commands the 108th Sustainment Brigade. My unit has been supported by her operations for the past 18 months. She's directly responsible for the success of multiple classified missions and has saved more Special Forces lives than any logistics officer in recent memory." Dad's fork clattered onto his plate. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Madison looked like she was about to faint. "Those supply deliveries you've been joking about," Jake continued, his voice gaining strength, "include ammunition, medical supplies, and specialized equipment that my team depends on to survive in hostile territory. Those administrative decisions you've been mocking determine whether soldiers come home alive." Madison tried to speak, but no words came out. Her face had gone completely white, and she was gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Jake finally lowered his salute but remained at attention. "Ma'am, I apologize for not identifying myself sooner. I was following operational security protocols regarding my assignment, but I couldn't let these comments continue without addressing them." I remained seated, letting the weight of the revelation settle over the room like dust after an explosion. The family dinner that Madison had orchestrated to showcase her perfect life had just revealed that her fiancé was not only military, but subordinate to the sister she'd been systematically humiliating for years. "At ease, Captain," I said quietly. Jake relaxed slightly but maintained his military posture. Madison finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You never told me," she said, looking at Jake with something between betrayal and terror. "Operational security," he replied simply. "My cover was as a government contractor working on military accounts." Which wasn't technically false, just incomplete. The room remained frozen in tableau, everyone processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Madison's carefully constructed evening had imploded in the most spectacular way possible, and there was no script for how to recover from this level of public humiliation. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking. The revelation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore and even more impossible to take back. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, each note falling into the suffocating silence like stones dropped into still water. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The dining room had become a freeze frame of the exact moment when carefully constructed lies collided with unavoidable truth. Madison was the first to break. A strangled sob escaped her throat, followed immediately by a hand pressed against her mouth, as if she could physically prevent the sound of her own humiliation from escaping. Her engagement ring caught the candlelight as her hands trembled, the diamond that had represented her perfect future now sparkling with the light of her shattered assumptions. "I didn't know," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Jake, you never said, I thought you were just, I didn't know she was." Her ability to form complete sentences seemed to have abandoned her along with her composure. For someone who made her living crafting persuasive messages, Madison appeared to have run out of words entirely. Jake remained standing, his posture still respectfully military, but his expression beginning to show the personal cost of maintaining operational security while watching the woman he'd planned to marry systematically humiliate his commanding officer. "Madison," he said quietly, "I tried to redirect the conversation multiple times. I tried to signal that you were mischaracterizing your sister's role. You weren't listening." Dad finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. "Sarah, we had no idea about your rank, about what you actually do. You never told us you were commanding anything." The accusation implicit in his statement hung in the air, This was somehow my fault for not correcting their assumptions, for allowing them to minimize my achievements, for not forcing them to acknowledge what they clearly didn't want to see. Would it have mattered? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. When I made captain, Madison told people I was playing dress-up. When I made major, she said it was political correctness. Every promotion, every achievement, every attempt to share what my career actually involved was dismissed or diminished. Why would Lieutenant Colonel be any different? Mom had been sitting in stunned silence, but now she spoke up with the kind of defensive tone that suggested she was trying to rewrite history in real time. We've always been proud of you, Sarah. We just didn't understand the details of what you do. No, I said, not unkindly but with absolute firmness. You didn't want to understand. There's a difference. Jake shifted slightly, drawing attention back to himself. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful professionalism of someone delivering a difficult brief to senior leadership. Ma'am, if I may, he said, addressing me directly. Your operational support saved my team's lives during our deployment to Syria last year. The emergency resupply mission you coordinated when our supply lines were compromised. That was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Madison made a choking sound that might have been intended as speech. Jake continued, his words precise and devastating. The paperwork you've been joking about included real-time coordination with the Pentagon, State Department, and 3 allied nations. The, quote, supply deliveries involved bypassing hostile territory and diplomatic obstacles that had been considered insurmountable. Your sister planned and executed an operation that will be studied at the War College for years. Each detail landed like a physical blow. Madison's face had progressed from white to a grayish pallor that suggested she might actually be sick. Her carefully applied makeup was beginning to smear, as tears she couldn't control started to fall. I need some air, she said suddenly, pushing back from the table with such force that her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. She rushed toward the back door, her heels clicking frantically against the tile. The sound of the door slamming left the rest of us sitting in the wreckage of what was supposed to have been a celebration. Mom immediately rose to follow Madison, her maternal instincts overriding everything else, but Dad caught her arm. Let her process this, he said quietly. She needs a moment. Jake finally sat down, though his posture remained formally correct. He looked across the table at me with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal regret. Ma'am, I owe you an explanation about the operational security protocols, he said. My cover identity as a marketing contractor was approved by command specifically because it allowed me to maintain relationships in civilian communities without compromising mission security. I understand, Captain, I replied. You followed proper protocols. The situation became untenable through no fault of yours. Dad was staring at both of us like we were speaking a foreign language, which in many ways we were. The precision of military communication, the weight of rank and responsibility, the casual discussion of classified operations. This was a world that existed completely outside his experience. Sarah, he said finally, how long have you been commanding things? 4 years as a lieutenant colonel, 8 years in various leadership positions before that. And we never knew because I met his eyes directly. Because every time I tried to explain what my job actually involved, someone in this family found a way to minimize it. Because Madison turned my achievements into punchlines. And you and Mom let her. Because it became easier to let you believe I was a supply clerk than to keep fighting for recognition that clearly wasn't coming. The words hung in the air with a finality that couldn't be undone. Dad's face cycled through several emotions: surprise, guilt, defensiveness, and finally something that might have been understanding. Mom returned from the back porch, her face drawn with worry. She's sitting by the pool, she said. She won't talk to me. She just keeps saying, I ruined everything over and over. Jake stood immediately. I should go to her. Should you? I asked, not challenging, but genuinely curious. This changes things between you two significantly. He paused, considering the question with the thoroughness it deserved. It changes everything, he admitted. I can't pretend I didn't hear what I heard tonight. I can't know what I now know about how she views military service, about how she treats family members, about her capacity for empathy when it conflicts with her need to feel superior. Mom looked stricken. Jake, she loves you. She has a hard time when she's not the center of attention. Mrs. Walsh, with respect, Jake said carefully, tonight wasn't about attention. It was about basic human decency. Your daughter has been systematically humiliating a superior officer for years, and she did it with such casual cruelty that she never even considered the possibility that her words might have consequences. The assessment was delivered without malice, but with the kind of clear-eyed evaluation that left no room for denial or rationalization. Jake had shifted from civilian fiancé to military professional, and from that perspective, Madison's behavior wasn't quirky or competitive. It was unacceptable. So what happens now? Dad asked. Jake looked at me before answering, a gesture of respect that hadn't gone unnoticed. That depends on several factors that are above my pay grade, he said. But personally, I need to reconsider whether I can build a life with someone whose values are so fundamentally incompatible with my own. Through the back window, we could see Madison sitting motionless by the pool, her silhouette dark against the underwater lighting. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of realizations she could no longer avoid. Mom was crying now, quiet tears that spoke to the collapse of assumptions she'd held about her family, her daughters, and the careful balance she'd worked so hard to maintain. Dad reached over and took her hand, both of them beginning to understand that this evening had changed more than just Madison's relationship status. The family dinner that was supposed to celebrate an engagement had instead revealed the fault lines that had been hidden beneath years of polite fiction and willful ignorance. There would be no easy recovery from this, no diplomatic solution that restored the comfortable status quo. As I sat in my childhood dining room, surrounded by the ruins of carefully maintained family myths, I realized that the truth had finally been spoken. Not diplomatically, not gradually, but with the explosive force of a revelation that could no longer be contained. The question now was whether any of us would have the courage to build something honest from the pieces. 6 months had passed since that explosive family dinner, and I found myself standing in the congressional hearing room where the House Armed Services Committee was reviewing military family support initiatives. The mahogany-paneled chamber buzzed with the controlled energy of political process, staffers shuffling papers, while representatives prepared for testimony that could reshape how the military addressed internal family conflicts. Colonel Mitchell, said Congressman David Park, the committee chairman, your research suggests that traditional family counseling approaches may actually be counterproductive in certain military contexts. That's a significant departure from established policy. I adjusted the microphone before responding, my dress blues bearing the eagles of my recent promotion to full colonel, a rank that Madison still didn't know I'd achieved, and probably never would. Sir, the data indicates that when family members actively undermine military service through systematic character assassination, standard reconciliation-focused therapy often enables continued abuse while placing the burden of fixing the relationship on the service member. Representative Maria Santos leaned forward in her chair. Can you provide specific examples of this dynamic without compromising individual privacy? Yes, ma'am. We documented cases where military personnel were told by family therapists to, quote, communicate better, with relatives who had spent years publicly mocking their service, questioning their competence, or spreading false information about their roles. The therapy became another venue for the family members to express contempt, while the service member was expected to absorb it in the name of, quote, family harmony. The numbers were staggering. Over 1,200 military personnel had participated in the study across 15 installations, revealing patterns of family dysfunction that traditional support programs weren't equipped to address. 37% reported family members who actively discouraged their military service. 22% had relatives who spread misinformation about their roles to others. 15% dealt with family members who used military deployments as opportunities to damage their reputations in civilian communities. Senator Patricia Williams, a veteran herself, asked the question I'd been expecting. Colonel, what's the difference between normal family tensions and the kind of systematic undermining you're describing? Intent and persistence, ma'am. Normal family concerns involve questions asked in good faith, expressions of worry about safety, or requests for better communication. Systematic undermining involves deliberate minimization of achievements, public humiliation, refusal to acknowledge factual information about military roles, and attempts to pressure service members into abandoning their careers through emotional manipulation. The distinction wasn't academic. It was the difference between families who struggled to understand military life and families who weaponized that lack of understanding. The difference between love expressed through concern and control exercised through contempt. Representative John Torres raised his hand. What does your proposed intervention model look like in practice? I clicked to the next slide in my presentation, showing the three-tiered approach that had evolved from 6 months of field testing. Tier 1. Individual counseling focused on boundary setting and self-advocacy skills. Service members learn to distinguish between reasonable family concerns and manipulative behavior. Tier 2. Legal advocacy when family members engage in defamation that could impact security clearances or career advancement. Tier 3. Alternative support networks that provide the emotional validation and practical assistance that healthy families typically offer. The pilot programs had exceeded every expectation. At Fort Hood, a young sergeant whose mother had been telling neighbors he was just a desk clerk learned to set clear boundaries about how his service could be discussed. When she continued the pattern, he limited contact to written communication only. 6 months later, she was asking genuine questions about his work and expressing pride she'd never shown before. At Naval Station Norfolk, a lieutenant whose siblings constantly joked about her playing sailor had worked with program counselors to craft direct responses to dismissive comments. The first time she corrected their assumptions with specific details about her responsibilities, the dynamic shifted permanently. They stopped making jokes because they finally understood what they were joking about. But the most significant success story was closer to home than anyone in the hearing room knew. Captain Jake Thompson sat in the gallery behind me, having driven down from Fort Campbell specifically to observe these hearings. We'd maintained professional contact over the past 6 months, consulting on cases where his Special Forces perspective provided valuable insights into how family dysfunction affected operational readiness. Jake's experience with Madison had become a case study in the program, though all identifying details were carefully removed. The clinical language described a, quote, romantic relationship between military personnel and civilian family member of superior officers, where civilian engaged in systematic character assassination of superior officers without knowledge of professional connection. The case had helped refine protocols for situations where operational security requirements prevented immediate correction of false assumptions. More importantly, Jake's willingness to share his experience had helped other military personnel recognize similar patterns in their own relationships. 3 different soldiers had ended engagements after realizing their partner's treatment of military culture was fundamentally incompatible with their own values. 2 others had used boundary-setting techniques to transform relationships that might otherwise have remained dysfunctional. The afternoon session focused on implementation logistics. How would the program be funded? Which military occupational specialties showed the highest need for intervention? How could success be measured across different family structures and cultural backgrounds? I found myself thinking about measurements of success as I fielded questions from the committee. Traditional metrics focused on family reunification and relationship satisfaction, but the research had revealed that sometimes the healthiest outcome was decreased family contact, not increased harmony. The service member whose parents finally stopped criticizing his deployment schedule after he implemented structured communication boundaries. Was that success measured by improved family relationships or by his increased job performance and mental health? The answer was both, but traditional family support programs had only been equipped to measure the first. During a brief recess, I stepped into the hallway where Jake was waiting with coffee, and the kind of easy smile that had become familiar over our months of professional collaboration. How do you think it's going in there? He asked, handing me a cup. Better than expected. The committee seems genuinely interested in evidence-based approaches, rather than just defending existing programs. Jake nodded, then glanced around to ensure we had privacy. Sarah, I wanted you to know that Madison reached out to me last week. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the reflexive tension that still accompanied any mention of my sister. Oh? She wanted to clear the air about what happened. She said she'd been doing some soul-searching and wanted to apologize for how things ended between us. And? Jake's expression was carefully neutral, the look of someone who'd learned to analyze emotional manipulation with clinical precision. She apologized for not understanding my job better, but she framed it as if the problem was lack of information rather than unwillingness to listen when information was provided. She said she hoped we could be friends, maybe even work things out, now that she quote understands military culture better. The pattern was so predictable it was almost boring. Madison would never acknowledge the cruelty of her behavior or the systematic nature of her dismissiveness. She would always find ways to reframe conflicts as misunderstandings, her actions as innocent mistakes, her impact as unintended consequences. How did you respond? I told her I appreciated the contact, but that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt with good intentions alone. I said I hoped she'd found happiness, but that we wanted different things from life and relationships. It was a diplomatic way of saying what he'd told me months earlier. That character revealed under pressure was character, not performance. Madison had shown him who she was when her assumptions were challenged, and he'd learned to trust that revelation more than her subsequent explanations. She asked about you, Jake continued. Wanted to know if we stayed in touch, if I knew how you were doing. I kept it general, but I got the impression she was fishing for information about whether you were angry with her. What did you tell her? That you seemed to be thriving professionally and personally. That you'd found ways to channel your experiences into work that was helping other people. I didn't mention the congressional testimony or the research program. I nodded, appreciating his discretion. Madison didn't need to know about my current projects, just as she'd never needed to know about my past achievements. Her interest was likely motivated by curiosity about whether she still had power to affect my emotional state, not genuine concern for my well-being. The afternoon session resumed with questions about long-term sustainability. How could military installations maintain these programs through budget cycles and leadership changes? How could success stories be shared without compromising the privacy of participants? Representative Santos asked the question that brought everything full circle. Colonel Mitchell, what advice would you give to military families who recognize these dysfunctional patterns but aren't sure how to address them? I thought about my parents, who had spent the past 6 months volunteering with military family support groups in Denver. Dad had become an advocate for civilian family members, helping them understand the realities of military life through structured education programs rather than assumptions and stereotypes. Mom had started a support group for parents whose military children were stationed far from home, focusing on healthy communication strategies and respectful boundary setting. Start with honesty, I said. Not brutal honesty designed to inflict pain, but clear, direct communication about impact and expectations. If someone's behavior is undermining your mental health or career prospects, say so specifically. Give them the opportunity to change, but don't make your well-being contingent on their willingness to do so. Senator Williams followed up. And if they don't change? Then you change your level of engagement to protect your own stability and effectiveness. Love doesn't require accepting abuse. Family connection doesn't require sacrificing professional competence. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior by continuing to absorb its impact. Quote, the hearing concluded with committee members expressing strong support for expanding the pilot programs into a military-wide initiative. Funding would be allocated through the next defense appropriations bill. Training protocols would be developed for family life counselors, chaplains, and unit leadership. Most importantly, the military was officially recognizing that family support sometimes meant supporting service members in establishing boundaries with their families, not just bringing families closer together. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the hearing room, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a logistics officer whose family treated her career as an embarrassing hobby. Today, I was a colonel whose research was reshaping military policy, and whose experience was helping hundreds of other service members navigate similar challenges. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been painless. Learning to set boundaries with my parents had required multiple difficult conversations and the willingness to disappoint people I loved. Accepting that Madison might never acknowledge the harm she'd caused meant grieving the sister relationship I'd always hoped to have. Building new support networks meant investing time and emotional energy in relationships that weren't guaranteed by blood or history. but the results spoke for themselves. My job performance had improved dramatically once I stopped expending emotional energy on managing family dysfunction. My mental health was better than it had been in years. My relationship with my parents, while different than before, was built on mutual respect rather than obligatory tolerance. Most importantly, the work I was doing now would prevent other military families from enduring the same destructive patterns that had shaped my own experience. The research would influence policy for decades. The intervention protocols would be refined and improved by future practitioners. The fundamental shift in how military institutions understood family dynamics would create space for healthier relationships and more effective support systems. Jake caught up with me as I walked toward the Capitol parking garage. "Congratulations on today," he said. "You handled those questions like you were briefing the Joint Chiefs." "Thanks." It feels surreal that a family dinner could lead to congressional testimony, but here we are. Quote, "That dinner changed a lot of lives," Jake said thoughtfully. "Mine included. I learned things about character and integrity that I probably wouldn't have learned any other way." We reached my rental car, and Jake extended his hand in the formal military farewell that had become our standard goodbye. "Keep me posted on how the implementation goes. If you need a Special Forces perspective on any of the case studies, you know how to reach me." "I will. Thank you for your support today, and for everything over the past 6 months." As I drove back toward Ronald Reagan Airport for my flight to Fort Bragg, I thought about the different paths that had emerged from that single evening 6 months ago. Madison had chosen defensiveness and denial, constructing narratives that protected her self-image while preventing genuine growth. My parents had chosen curiosity and change, using their discomfort as motivation to understand rather than judge. Jake had chosen integrity over convenience, ending a relationship that was fundamentally incompatible with his values. And I had chosen to transform personal pain into institutional change, using my experience as the foundation for work that would outlast any individual family drama. The congressional testimony would be transcribed and archived, but its real impact would be measured in the lives of service members who learned they didn't have to choose between family loyalty and professional competence. In the families who discovered that love could coexist with boundaries. In the military culture that slowly evolved to recognize that sometimes the strongest families were the ones people chose for themselves, rather than the ones they were born into. As the plane lifted off from Washington and turned south toward North Carolina, I opened my laptop and began drafting the implementation timeline for the expanded program. There was work to be done, policies to write, training programs to develop. But for the first time in my adult life, I was doing that work from a position of choice rather than obligation, surrounded by colleagues who valued my contributions and supported my mission. The family that had once diminished me had inadvertently launched me toward the most meaningful work of my career. Sometimes the best revenge was simply becoming who you were meant to be, with or without their permission. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.